Order.
Que ton esprit nous accompagne et nous guide dans notre travail pour le bien de tous, pour la paix et la justice sur notre territoire et pour la reconnaissance constante de la dignité et des aspirations de ceux qui nous servent. Amen.
Merci. Good morning, members. Minister's statement. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to take this opportunity to update members on our fiscal and economic situation and some of our ongoing challenges. When I presented the 2018-19 budget in February, I noted the progress we had made towards our fiscal strategy, but also described our revenue challenges, with total revenue for 2018-19 expected to be about $120 million less than 2016-17 revenues. This decline in revenue over a two-year period has presented an enormous challenge for our government. We have met that challenge through careful management of expenditure growth while still advancing actions described in the mandate of the 18th Legislative Assembly. Mr. Speaker, we are now at about the midpoint of the fiscal year, and I can report as we continue to be on track with signs of very modest improvements in our fiscal environment in the future. For 2018-19, federal infrastructure contributions are responsible for slightly higher revenues than expected at the time of the 2018-19 main estimates. As the planned infrastructure contributions grow over the next few years, our revenues will also grow. Additionally, we're seeing indicators of improved stability in our own source revenues over the next few years and modest increases in our territorial formula financing grant from Canada. Mr. Speaker, as members know, we need to balance revenue growth with expenditure growth unless we plan to continually take on more debt. We are all aware of our expenditure pressures, including the impacts of aging population, the need for strategic investments in education and wellness, the importance of strategic infrastructure and other investments to support our economy, and the importance of reaching a fair collective agreement with our employees. The Legislative Assembly and future Legislative Assembly will need to continue to carefully manage our fiscal resources to ensure our overall sustainability, to help create a future where our people can thrive and be healthy, where a well-managed environment contributes to our economic well-being and quality of life, and where a strong economy provides jobs and opportunities for our communities, as well as funding for community governments. Mr. Speaker, the N.W.T economy continues to show mixed results. Indicators like retail and wholesale trade, labour income, and diamond production all show strong growth in a year-to-date basis compared to the same period in 2017. Information on resident employment, income support cases, and the overall territorial population show deterioration compared to the same period in 2017. The medium-term forecast for our economy needs to reflect the reality that the N.W.T economy continues to be built on the foundation of resource development and will continue to be into the future. We need to face the reality that our diamond mines are maturing and we cannot take our economic foundation for granted. We need to continue to make strategic investments in our infrastructure and continue to build our base through diversifying our economy. The Northern Prosperity Economic Symposium that was held in early October and included leaders from the GNWT and Indigenous governments reinforced the importance of finding concrete ways to work together to support a prosperous and strong territory. Mr. Speaker, during this sitting, we will be considering the capital estimates 2019-2020. As part of this plan, we are proposing $118 million for highways, $90 million for social infrastructure, $42 million for energy projects, $29 million for community governments, and $62 million in other projects in support of program delivery. This investment creates important economic activity and jobs throughout the Northwest Territories. The Northwest Territories and our government is facing significant economic challenges, but I hope that I can provide to this House and to the residents of our territory with some assurance that this government will always remain mindful of our long-term financial objectives and the future well-being of the people we were elected to serve. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister statement. Minister Ike Godin and then Minister N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation has been working collaboratively with the Tlicho government to address critical housing issues in the Tlicho region. In order to meet this government's commitments to address the cost of living, the Housing Corporation is continuing to implement northern solutions for northern housing. A crucial element of this approach is working in partnership with other orders of government, such as the Tlicho, to address affordable housing challenges. Mr. Speaker, the Tlicho government and the government of the Northwest Territories formed a working group involving leadership from all Tlicho communities, as well as senior management from the Housing Corporation. The group has met a number of times over the past year, leading to improved planning and an acceleration of housing activities. The group has identified and prioritized areas that would benefit from an increased focus, including repairs and maintenance, analyzing the existing housing stock, finding solution to homelessness, avoiding evictions, building capacity, and improved communications with residents of the Tlicho region. I am encouraged by the recent work that has been undertaken by the Tlicho government and the government of the Northwest Territories Housing Working Group. I look forward to reporting on the actions that they will take in these areas. I want to promote the work that is already being done by the Housing Corporation to address many of these issues. One of these actions is the introduction of a housing stability worker in Beshico. This person will work towards supporting residents in developing strategies to keep their housing. Sometimes the obligations related to housing can be lost in the demand of addressing other pressing issues such as addictions, childcare, family violence, poor health, and other social issues. The housing stability worker will work with vulnerable tenants by connecting them to vital community programs and services. This support approach will hopefully lead to more stable tenancies. This program is up and running in Beshico right now with an office set up in the Tlicho Kogacho complex. Mr. Speaker, I want to also let this House know that the Northern Pathways to Housing program is expected to be completed in Beshico in the near future. This project is designed to help address homelessness. Once finished, it will house 4 single adults who would have otherwise been experiencing homelessness. This project has already shown to be successful so far in Fort Simpson, where 4 previously homeless individuals have been stably housed for nearly half a year. Mr. Speaker, this project is truly an example of a northern solution for northern housing. At the inception of its design, there were no projects like it anywhere in this country. Mr. Speaker, the Northern Pathways program is intended to house people first and then to improve their housing sustainability by addressing the issues that contributed to their homelessness. This approach is indicative of how our government is looking for ways to deliver services in a more integrated manner. In support of our elders remaining in their homes, communities, the Housing Corporation recently constructed a seniors aging in place 9-plex in N.W.T. This facility was toured by the federal deputy ministers just the other day and showcases the innovative approaches that the Northwest Territories is taking to address our issues. I am hopeful that this important infrastructure will result in more seniors staying in YELLOWKNIFE and continuing to pass on their wisdom to our future generations. Lastly, the Housing Corporation has begun preliminary discussions with the Tlicho towards the development of 4 community housing plans for the region. Each individual community will feed into a larger regional plan. These housing plans will be developed by the community for their community. The Northwest Territories Housing Corporation will look to hire a local facilitator to gather local feedback and to help plan for a community housing forum. At the end of the process, communities will have a detailed, comprehensive community profile and needs analysis and a housing plan. These plans will be invaluable going forward for all housing stakeholders. They could be utilized for planning for new infrastructure, partnership proposals for any level of government, supporting private market proponents in their projects, housing design, and numerous other housing planning purposes. The Northwest Territories Housing Corporation has presented this concept to the Tlicho government and the government of the Northwest Territories Working Group, and will be working with the Tlicho representatives towards the development of these plans over the next year. My understanding is that at least one community housing plan will be initiated in the Tlicho region in the coming weeks upon formal approval of the community's leadership. Mr. Speaker, we all know that there are considerable housing challenges in our small communities. We all know that there are considerable housing challenges in YELLOWKNIFE, Beshiko, N.W.T, and N.W.T. Tackling these issues head-on together is what is required. I know that the Tlicho leadership appreciates the efforts of the Tlicho government and the government of the Northwest Territories Housing Working Group. Joining forces with the Tlicho government will provide more leverage to our efforts. I look forward to improved housing outcomes as we work together towards shared housing aspirations for our people. Masicho, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister statement. Minister Ike the Minister Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, our government is following through on its commitment to invest in transportation infrastructure by strengthening connections with our federal partners. Improving our existing highway system helps keep communities connected while improving safety for all road users. This also provides jobs and fosters skills and capacity development for all Northerners. Today, I'm pleased to provide an update on many highway improvements that were undertaken this year. Mr. Speaker, we have improved more than 200 kilometers of highway this summer, including 3 community access roads and 3 bridges at a cost of $46.4 million. This work was funded by the Government of the Northwest Territories and the federal government under the Government of Canada's new Building Canada plan. On Highway 1, work got underway to improve the embankment and drainage from kilometers 207 to 222. Pit development and material production, culvert installations were undertaken, and work has progressed to a point where improvements to this section can be completed next year. Improvements along Highway Number 1 also included the complete resurfacing of the Fort Simpson and Kikisa access roads. Rehabilitation completed from kilometers 256 to 332 of Highway Number 3 this summer have resulted in the improved road surface, road widening, structural strengthening, drainage improvements, resurfacing, and chip seal all took place on this section of roadway between Betchako and Yellowknife. Rehabilitation work on the approaches to the Decho Bridge, including reconstruction of approach shoulders, soil nailing, asphalt surface repairs were completed earlier this fall and have further strengthened connections along this route. Along the Ingram Trail, roadway widening, structural strengthening, drainage improvements, resurfacing, and application of chip seal took place between kilometer 49 and 51, and this work is substantially completed. Progress was also made on further planning and surveys intended to support the design of additional guardrail installations along this highway. Mr. Speaker, rehabilitation of Highway number 6 from kilometer 28 to 42 were completed this summer. This highway is now completely chip sealed, providing improved comfort and safety to travelers and residents of Fort Resolution. Highway number 7 also saw surface improvements between kilometers 137.5 and 153 to help mitigate impacts on the highway water susceptible soil. Mr. Speaker, our northernmost highways also received improvements this summer, with brushing, gravel surfacing taking place along the Dempster Highway, and the start of reconstruction work on the Inuvik Airport Access Road. The Inuvik Airport Access Road project is now 35% complete. The final completion inspection of the Inuvik to Tuktoyaktuk Highway is scheduled for the end of October. All signs, guardrails, and delineators will have been installed at that time. The operation of this highway was a success this past year as many tourists visit the area. Mr. Speaker, bridges are an essential part of our highway system. It is important to ensure our bridges are maintained and rehabilitated appropriately, which is why the government has a number of bridge projects on the go. This summer, we completed the rehabilitation of the Buffalo River Bridge on Highway 5, which allows the bridge to handle modern highway loads and ensures extended service life. Work also began this month on the replacement of the Hay River to Pine Point Bridge on Highway number 5. The project involves replacing the bridge structure, and construction is expected to be completed by the fall of 2019. Once completed, the bridge will be an open bridge deck to better meet the current and projected traffic loads. During rehabilitation, traffic will be diverted to the nearby CN Rail Bridge. Mr. Speaker, in addition to improving our existing highway system, we have also committed to expanding our system. I'm pleased to say that the Canyon Creek Access Road near Norman Wells is scheduled to officially open this November. Construction of this road has provided significant boost to the Satu region. To date, 84 people have been employed through the Canyon Creek All-Season Access Road project, 28 of which were local Satu residents and 36 of which were northerners from parts of the territory. 8 of these individuals are now qualified heavy equipment operators. These training and employment opportunities have allowed residents of the Satu to gain valuable skills that will be useful for future projects and opportunities. With this new road, residents will benefit from improved access to traditional hunting and fishing and other recreational opportunities. The road could open up potential resource development south of Norman Wells. Looking ahead, our government is preparing another active highway construction season with the reconstruction work scheduled for sections of highways 1, 3, 4, 7, and 8. This work will be funded under the Government of Northwest Territories' third bundle of highway capacity improvement projects approved under the new Building Canada plan, and will extend the work done under the previous bundles to support safety travel, community access roads, and resource development. Mr. Speaker, our highway systems is an essential part of our transportation network. It connects communities and unlocks our economic potential by enabling exploration and development. We will continue to work with the federal government to secure further funding for short and long-term infrastructure needs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister statements. Minister statements. Member statement. Member from Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in February 2017, I stood up in this House and asked the Minister of Education to undertake a foundational review of Aurora College. I asked because I believed the college was both underperforming and underutilized. Education is the cornerstone of every prosperous society. With a presence in 24 communities, Aurora College is key to achieving true and lasting prosperity across the N.W.T. But as they say, be careful what you ask for because you just might get it. The foundational review has been completed, and while the report echoed many of the concerns I've heard, it's more of a proposal than an evaluation. The report essentially has one overarching recommendation, which is to have the government transform the college into a university based in Yellowknife. Because of time constraints, I'll list only a few of the reasons why I reject this recommendation. The first is simple. We must stand guard against the onslaught of centralization of services in the capital. which come at the expense of other communities. I refuse to allow this Assembly to pull the plug on Fort Smith. The second is that it's irresponsible to embark down a path of spending an unknown but undoubtedly immense amount of our limited funds on a university when we have a graduation rate of 67% in the N.W.T, which is actually closer to 40% in the communities, and when many of the graduates require upgrading before they can even consider post-secondary. After high school, there's no shortage of universities to attend, but before graduation, our students usually only have one choice of school, and those are the schools we need to invest in if we want to effect lasting change for our residents. Another reason is that although Aurora College is an arm's-length institution, attached to that arm is the hand of the N.W.T wrapped firmly around the neck of the college. The Department of ECE bears much of the responsibility for the state of the college, and for this Assembly to sign a blank check authorizing ECE to go ahead and build the university would be to neglect our core oversight function. However, Mr. Speaker, with all that being said, I'm not opposed to the eventual growth of Aurora College into a polytechnic university, but that isn't something we should rush into based on a consultant's report. Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to conclude my statement.
Merci. Member Nitligatia Sadzasua, Adi Amik Animule. Member Hay River North, Huntigik Agniwon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, colleagues. First, we must fix the issues at Aurora College so that it can provide the educational services that our residents need and deserve. At the same time, we can begin to lay a solid foundation so that the college can develop and grow, premised on successful program delivery and based not on the opinion of a Southern consultant, but on the collective vision of our people. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member statements. Member Ike Gooddan and the member Nehende.
Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on September 25th, Recreation North provided a news release that spoke about what they had done and are planning to do. Recreation North 2015 Arctic Exploration Prize Laureate is a tri-territorial partnership of the Recreation Parks Association of Yukon, the N.W.T Recreation Parks Association, and Recreation Parks Association of Nunavut. It was established to provide training to strengthen the capacity of recreation leaders in northern, rural, and remote communities. I believe the training is a great supplement to what the Department of Municipal and Community Affairs is presently doing. Mr. Speaker, after developing and piloting training for northern recreation leaders, Recreation North announced its future plans. The Recreation North training program, launched in November 2018, will be a series of remote delivered learning events. Evaluation of the pilot demonstrated the value of training to the participants and employees. I'd like to share a couple of comments from the first participants. I appreciate learning from the others. A lot of brilliant ideas and creativity was shared. Most of our experience was very similar, even though we came from 3 different territories. Staff have gained confidence and was able to do the programming. The person was able to apply what they learned and instantly, and I was able to see him doing it on a regular basis. Moving forward, Recreation North is making a few changes to the training program by offering flexible learning opportunities. The program is flexible and works around people's work schedule and is on online blocks. This is really good. Students can work around busy schedules and complete certification at a reasonable pace in a reasonable way. Mr. Speaker, the training comprises of a series of learning events delivered remotely by distance. In-person learning is offered through each Territorial Recreation and Parks Association. Each learning event takes about 5 hours to complete. Individuals may take 1, 2, or several learning events for personal interest or professional development, or choose 12 learning events for certification in Northern Recreation Leadership. The flexibility is how the program is now laid out, will allow individuals to begin at the point without the year. I would like to thank the Recreation North for all the work and look forward to seeing future success stories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Gooddan and the member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Back in February, the Premier made a statement about the Arctic Policy Framework that included a reference to a Northern Summit on Economic Development. When I questioned the Premier on this initiative on March 1st, he said, quote, purpose of the summit is to seek input into the writing of the N.W.T. chapter of the Arctic Policy Framework, end of quote, that it would likely be held within the next couple of months. The Premier further stated that we would be, quote, paying for experts in different economic sectors to participate, end of quote. The Premier said, quote, we are realizing that to diversify our economy is not as easy as it looks or sounds. We need input from every sector or every possible source so that we can come up with a plan that will work. Just relying on our traditional sources to come up with a vision and a new economic diversification is not as easy as it sounds. We want to be as inclusive as possible, end of quote. When asked if regular MLAs would be allowed to participate, the Premier said, quote, we would be pleased to discuss it with committees certainly, but that our experience has been that sometimes it affects the input from people who are there, but certainly I have no problem with it. We should at least have a discussion on it, end of quote. The first notice regular MLAs received of this event that was held October 1 to 3 came via the weekly media advisory on ministerial activities on September the 24th. The same day, I asked the Premier for an agenda and a participant list. That was finally provided 3 days later after I raised the request a second time. Sorry, I can't share the agenda or participant list because, believe it or not, the guest list for this consultation is confidential. I can confirm that the focus appears to have been largely related to non-renewable resource development. Happily, the communique issued on October the 4th from the symposium seems to take a more balanced approach, but was again made without any input from this side of the House. I will have questions for the Premier about the N.W.T. Economic Symposium and what happened with the commitments he made in this House to make this event inclusive, balanced and collaborative. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Goodanian, the member Yellowknife Centre.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on Tuesday morning last week, I woke to the news that the Rock Hill apartments were on fire. When I looked out my kitchen window, I could see the black smoke, and I feared for the lives of the families who called Rock Hill home. For 20 years, the Transitional Housing Program has helped hundreds of families rebuild their lives. It has become indispensable, and I worked there myself for 6 years. The good news is that all 87 people who lived at Rock Hill escaped unharmed. The bad news, of course, is that the building was destroyed. Mr. Speaker, since the fire, the YWCA has had an overwhelming amount of good news. First, Northview property had enough empty units to accommodate most of the families. The remainder found places on their own, or they have now bunked in with family and friends. Another highlight was the government response. The City of Yellowknife opened their facilities. A GNWT emergency response team came in to register families and provide them with services, from replacing ID to reissuing income assistance checks. Mr. Speaker, businesses stepped up. The diamond mining companies pledged money. DC Moving spent 3 days picking up and dropping off furniture. The co-op donated $7,500 in gift cards. This isn't the whole list, but it's an indication of how business rallied to the cause. Faith groups joined in as well. St. Vincent de Paul Society provided vouchers for shopping at their thrift store and collected clothing donations, while the Islamic Center bought new kitchen supplies for families. The Salvation Army provided all the meals at the multiplex and the field house. Individuals went out of their way with online donations. The Students Against Drunk Driving at St. Pat sold slushy drinks. The Department of Justice collected gift cards. Another group held a scavenger hunt. Yellowknife Catholic Schools hosted a Thanksgiving dinner. Mr. Speaker, the response has been so generous, it's truly overwhelming. The YWCA now faces some tough decisions about the future of its housing program and housing staff, and they do so with the knowledge that the community has their back. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Goodanian, the member Satu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Notwithstanding the last spike, Mr. Speaker, realizing the potential, the Satu potential in the area as an major economic contributor towards the territorial and national GDP. Mr. Speaker, all-season road access to this region's 26% of the N.W.T. land quantum is essential to our N.W.T.'s resource development initiative while reducing the cost of living. Mr. Speaker, while ongoing discussions of investment confidence informing the Arctic policy framework and the modernization regulatory reform is strategically complementary, fundamental to any project is financing. Mr. Speaker, with the recent June Mackenzie Valley Highway funding announcement totals 37%. Mr. Speaker, tailoring and designing the next phase on this infrastructure includes the environmental assessment, a phase of public engagement. However, this project engagement would only be too common, which has had decades of public studies and community discussions. Mr. Speaker, carrying on from the draft Mackenzie Valley Environmental Impact Review Board's work plan dated December 2013 would allow 12 to 14 months on this scheduling, while meaningful regional household opportunities are underway for the Mount Gadet and Bear River Bridge construction. Later, Mr. Speaker, I will have questions for the appropriate minister. Mussey.
Mussey. Member statement. Member Ika Godana, the member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to speak on a topic today which is important to all Northerners: reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. For over a century, Indigenous children were removed from their community and sent to residential schools. These government-funded, church-run schools attempted to whitewash and re-educate the spiritual, cultural, and intellectual development of generations of Indigenous youth. This was a terrible mistake that has stained our shared history, and we as a society must accept the trauma we intentionally inflicted upon Indigenous peoples from coast to coast to coast. Orange Shirt Day is an important symbol that gives us all the opportunity to start serious conversations about what we did as governments and non-Indigenous Canadians and the cost we continue to pay as a society. Mr. Speaker, Orange Shirt Day in 2018 took place on September 30th. This day was chosen because it was historically the time of year in which youths were taken from their communities and homes to state and church-run residential schools. September 30th is an opportunity for educators to set the stage for anti-racism, anti-bullying, and reconciliation-oriented lessons for the school year. It also gives educators time to plan events that will include young Northerners, as we must ensure that we are passing these important lessons on to the next generations in the hopes that these travesties of education will never be repeated. I've had the honor of participating in Orange Shirt Day activities several times at N.J. McPherson School, which is located in my constituency. I applaud the efforts of the amazing administrators, teachers, and students. They are not only embracing Orange Shirt Day, but are helping to build a roadmap on how we can move forward together in the spirit of reconciliation. Mr. Speaker, Orange Shirt Day is a good start, and so too is the proposed new statutory holiday now being considered before the federal parliament. But these actions are only the beginning of the true process of reconciliation. Workshops and training programs that help Northerners understand the consequences of residential schools need to be held across communities and inside government institutions. We must all become acquainted with the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and commit to implementing them as a territory. Reconciliation will not be easy, but we must always strive towards it if we are to continue to live and thrive together in our shared land, country, and history. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mussey. Member statement. Member Ika Godana, the member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the carbon tax was supposed to be simple. Just raise the price of fuel and people will stop buying it. Voila, we change their behavior and save the planet. Instead, we're facing a mess that's derailing more and more each passing week. In May 2016, the Premier joined with his Yukon and Nunavut counterparts to just say no to a federal carbon tax. Then, only months later, we signed on to the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change, supporting a carbon tax. What changed in those few months? Mr. Speaker, in September 2017, I asked, what's our position regarding the carbon tax? Answer, we're working with our federal counterparts on a Made in the North carbon tax that will recognize the North's special circumstances. No clear detail was provided. Mr. Speaker, earlier this year, the N.W.T outlined our carbon tax plan. Frankly, it doesn't seem to be strong enough to change anyone's behavior. It's just moving money from your left pocket to your right pocket. Simply put, it's a wash. In the meantime, the rest of Canada is losing faith fast. Saskatchewan, out. Alberta, out. Ontario, out. PEI says it can reach targets without a tax. New Brunswick is taking a step back. Newfoundland is in no rush to pass a carbon tax, and Manitoba is out. Mr. Speaker, why couldn't common sense prevail from the beginning? There was never going to be a carbon tax applied in the N.W.T. that would change behavior. And why? Because no Northerner needs more motivation to reduce their use of fossil fuels because of what it costs to live here. When the discussion started, gas in Yellowknife was $1.13 per litre. Today in Yellowknife, gas costs nearly $1.50 per litre, Mr. Speaker. That's motivation enough to change people's behavior. Mr. Speaker, the Made in the North carbon tax appears to be a pointless, symbolic gesture that will cost our government a lot of money to administer, but will do very little for the world's climate. The $42 million mentioned by the Finance Minister today to support Northern residents, businesses, and the environment is the incentive-based approach we need to support. Mr. Speaker, let's join the rest of Canada and get off this sinking ship called the carbon tax. Later, I'll have questions for the Minister of Finance. Thank you.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Godan and the member N.W.T.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday I highlighted some new infrastructure projects that have recently been built in the riding of N.W.T. And on the same token, I would like to share with you today some future infrastructure in the riding will need in years to come. Mr. Speaker, the community of Deda has never had a new school building before. In 1969, the government placed a few portable classrooms together and called it a school. Then 20 years later, they added a few more portables. Along with some renovations along the way, it's a school for the Deda students. If you ask me, Mr. Speaker, I would say Deda is in dire need of a new school. The school is such an important aspect of the community. In this day and age, students need pride in the schools they attend. Similarly, Mr. Speaker, the community of Dilo is also in need of improved public infrastructure. In 2009, the N.W.T. constructed the Calamideni School. While the facility has served that community well, it is now in need of additional classroom space and a gymnasium. Specifically, they're asking for 2 more classrooms to be built in order to accommodate shortages of their existing school space, along with a gym to put them on even ground with other schools in Yellowknife. Mr. Speaker, both communities of Deda and Dilo are in need of adequate-sized gymnasiums. Currently, both of these communities have a community hall, which is used as a gym. They both have outgrown the facilities. Their rising populations will further necessitate the need for that infrastructure. Deda, in particular, is hurting at this front. The N.W.T. students would need to commute to Yellowknife just to participate in sporting activities. For most of the school year, the logistics of the Deda students coming to Yellowknife gym is not feasible. Lastly, Mr. Speaker, the community of Lutzelk'e is in need of a new health centre. I know it's in the works. However, there have been projects in larger communities like Yellowknife, Hay River, and Inuvik that get approved while the Lutzelk'e people wait. It is mandate of this government to put employment where employment is needed most. We all know where employment is needed most, and the projects such as a health centre in Lutzelk'e would create work. Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to conclude my statement.
Merci. Member Nitlige Nadait Danhe Kadi Amik Animule. Montigek Animal, member N.W.T. Nadant.
Mr. Speaker, would create work for a few years. Furthermore, the Lutzelk'e Health Centre is almost 35 years old, and it will be almost 40 by the time it is replaced. The standards have improved, Mr. Speaker. Our infrastructure must improve with it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Godan and the member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to bring to your attention the high cost of living in the Mackenzie Delta in Beaufort Delta region. My constituents work very hard to keep their homes warm in the winter, to feed their families and to maintain their vehicles. Mr. Speaker, these costs, the costs of normal business of daily life, add up very quickly. Imagine living in the Mackenzie Delta in 1978, where we waited on the banks for barges to come in to deliver food and supplies. I can't imagine the costs related to all the supplies or the amounts of trapping that had to be done in order to pay for food and supplies. When the Dempster Highway opened in 1979, it opened the rest of Canada to the north. And when the truckloads of food and supplies came down that highway, our people were happy. Costs were cut tremendously, but Mr. Speaker, it's been 40 years since then. Today, we have more people unemployed, and with jobs scarce, money is hard to come by. Food and other supplies that we need to live are increasingly out of reach. Many times, local families suffer because they can't buy healthy food or keep their homes heated. And what about the fuel supply itself? Last winter, Fort McPherson ran out of gas and groceries altogether. When shoulder season ferry services were cut, Mr. Speaker, these are the very outcomes I feared. Sky-high costs, bare shelves, and gas pumps run dry. Instead, it would make so much sense to keep the Lewis Cardinal and Abraham Francis ferries open until the ice bridge is built. Extending the length of the season would benefit communities and prevent transportation price markups. Improved access also makes the Mackenzie Delta more enticing to potential tourists. Earlier this Assembly, Mr. Speaker, ferry services were cut to save money. Any savings, though, have gone to the Department of Infrastructure, not to the people making their homes in our small communities. And I'd like to see action on this file, Mr. Speaker, and I'll have questions at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ike Goodden and the member N.W.T.
Good evening, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one of our biggest challenges this summer was trying to accommodate the big boom of tourism in Tuktoyaktuk. However, the community stepped up with whatever capacity they had to work with. The N.W.T did offer some support with small pots of funding, but the community is looking for something bigger like an RV park and a campground within or close to the community. Mr. Speaker, both the federal and territorial government have marketed the new highway to Tuktoyaktuk, connecting 3 oceans from sea to sea to sea. This marketing has caused a mad rush to Tuk. There's even been a huge promotion from GMC and Chevrolet, launching their new 2019 Silverado with the slogan, "Finding New Roads." We have seen some very good reviews on TripAdvisor, which guides web surfers to Tuktoyaktuk's new visitor center and other attractions. Mr. Speaker, the visitor center needs to be a larger building that community members and visitors can sit, talk, and learn from each other. Mr. Speaker, this promotion has brought a lot of media coverage, helping Tuktoyaktuk become advertised around the world. Mr. Speaker, this is good news, but it may bring an influx of tourism that could overwhelm the community. It is also very important that Tuktoyaktuk has the means to ensure that tourist experiences are good ones they will tell their friends about, rave about on Facebook, and review on internet web travel sites. To do that, the community needs both services and infrastructure and a plan to develop them. Mr. Speaker, Tuktoyaktuk tourism has great potential if we do it right. Mr. Speaker, later I'll have questions for the Minister of ITI.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ike Goodden and the member Decho.
Mr. Speaker. First, I'd like to welcome my colleagues back to the House. I'm glad to be back myself, Mr. Speaker. Also came to share some very exciting news for conservation, reconciliation, and the future of our territory. Go home, Grand Chief Gladys Norwegian, hey, Guara, Sambanale environment, Guara climate change, Medede Catherine McKenna, Akon, Jatin de Queen, et de Deji, Sunizini on Kotaitin. Also known as the Horn Plateau, Edeji has been called the jewel in the breadbasket of the Decho. a place where Dene have turned for generations. Ideji means source waters, as it hosts the source waters for the Willow Lake, Horn, and Rabbit Skin rivers, and at 14,200 square kilometers, it's bigger than both the Banff and Jasper National Parks. In fact, it's bigger than about 40 countries, including the Bahamas and Lebanon. Ideji's designation as a protected area, the first Indigenous protected area in Canada, is a monumental achievement, the triumph of a process begun 20 years ago, and I want to congratulate all involved. As part of this agreement, idisinizini on Dechogora Sabana Le, idi asine cha make Ideji Nani Dala, Yundash. Ni deshu tlehele genda di Ideji Management Board ke senala genda gore decho kyo di guardians di dinse decho gindia. But the work doesn't stop here, Mr. Speaker. I know my colleagues are aware of the recent United Nations report warning of climate change crisis as early as 2040. Governments must meaningfully act on issues of conservation, land protection, and carbon emissions. This agreement to protect Ideji is one example of walking that walk. Dena laws tells us that the survival of the whole group, our families and our communities, is more important than the accumulation of individual wealth or status. Not to put too fine a point on it, Mr. Speaker, but if we are to survive, and if the land that we come from is to survive, we must act on what Dene laws describe as our collective responsibility to protect the land and resources for our children and grandchildren. I thank First Nations for continuing to lead in protecting the land, waters, and animals, and I look forward with hope to the work to come. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statements. Member statements. Returns to oral questions. Returns to oral questions. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to recognize my parents, Terry Testart and Maureen Marshall, and my aunt Lillian Testart. Everything I've learned about good public service, I owe to my parents, whose excellence and dedication in their careers made them the most important role models in my life. Thank you for being here today, and thank you for always being there for me. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I'd like to recognize Lois Little. Lois Little is a resident of Yellowknife North. She is a consultant and owner of Lutra Associates, and she is also the co-chair of the N.W.T. chapter of the Council of Canadians. Welcome, and also we're all very familiar with Craig Yeo, the CA to a couple of our members, and he's also a Yellowknife North resident. Welcome to the House. Thank you.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would also like to recognize Mr. Terry Testart as well, too. He was in a senior administrator office in Tuktoyaktuk for many years, so welcome, Terry. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I'd like to recognize Ms. Wendy Holmes. She's an award-winning Canadian agrologist, columnist, author, and speaker. She's here from British Columbia visiting and helping people in the Northwest Territories, particularly Fort Smith and Fort Resolution, where she visited, better understand the impacts of Site C Dam in British Columbia. I also would like to recognize Lois Little, who's the co-chair of the Northwest Territories chapter of the Council of Canadians, who's assisting with her visit. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. If we're missing anyone in the gallery, welcome to our chambers. It's always great to have an audience as part of our proceedings. Merci. Acknowledgements. Acknowledgements. Oral questions. Member for Nahande.
Thank you, Mr.
Mr. Speaker, with weather changing and the drop of water levels, we are seeing the MV Harvey ferry on 24-hour notice. It is at least 23 days earlier than the 15 years average. I'd want to recognize and thank the Marine staff. They've done a great job to keep the ferry operational as long as we can and for doing it in a safe manner. Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of Infrastructure. Can the Minister please advise the House how the Department is getting the message out to the residents and non-residents that the ferry is going to be shut down earlier than normal? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Infrastructure.
Opportunity to reach out to the Greater Northwest Territories to update the general public on the situation that's happening at the Liard Ferry. As most people know, this time of year the rivers drop off sharply. In the case of the Liard River, generally this time of year when it does drop down, it actually comes back up after a couple of days, but that hasn't happened in the last 3 days. It's actually at its lowest level, and we're actually probably operating our ferry presently at the lowest level that ferry is operating at. It's at 1.65 meters as of today. But to the member's point of thanking the Marine staff, they've reduced the fuel storage on the boat. They've gone to lighter loads to offset a premature shutdown of this ferry to help the residents of his riding. We are monitoring this on a day-to-day basis, but one thing that has come to light here in the last 24 hours or so, it looks like the river levels in Watson Lake have actually come up a little bit, so we're going to continue to monitor this. Weather is supposed to actually warm up a little bit in his region, so that's going to help us with that as well. But we continue to use all our means of getting the message out there. We have our electronic board at Enterprise. We have the electronic board at the Yellowknife Junction there to inform members. We have our Twitter account, we have our web page, and we have our 1-800 number. And as well as our staff on the ferries are continually updating the passengers as they cross the river system. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question na kida da kasi member na hindi.
Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that information. And yeah, they're operating the ferries at the level it's even unprecedented. So I'd like to thank again staff there. But because of the water level dropping in the channel, it needs to be dredged. When you sit there and you look at it and you talk to the ferry and you talk to residents, it needs to be dredged. So is the Minister able to advise if the Department has looked into the process of dredging this section of the river? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I looked into this matter, and I was informed by the Department 20 years ago we contracted Cooper's Barging with an excavator to have a look at doing this, and it was very unsuccessful. It wasn't able to be done. Another attempt at dredging this channel would need to involve a number of things now in light of the new regulatory system that's out there. We'd have to do an environmental studies on it, approval from multiple organizations. We'd have to go to the Mackenzie Valley Land and Water Board, the DFO, and of course there's always going to be a funding issue. So at this point right now, that's where it was at on the dredging issue, but if we were to ever consider this, that's the lay of the land that we'd have to consider. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, tada da kasi member na hindi.
And I thank the Minister for that answer. So I guess the question is, so from our riding, and a lot of people use this ferry and that, so will the Department start looking at this option or other options to see it again? Because we're talking 20 years ago, with modern technology now and equipment and that, will the Minister advise if this House, the Department's looking at that? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is no feasible option at this time besides dredging, so if we were to consider this, we'd have to go back and go through all the process that I just laid out in the previous question. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member na hindi.
Speaker, and I'd hope they actually would start looking into that and start planning for the future, because the water levels keep on dropping and regularly, and yeah, we're seeing Watson Lake go up and weather warming up, but we're still seeing the challenge. With the water dropping levels, and it's occurring on a regular basis, has the Department looked at ways to help reduce the cost of living during the ferry shutdown and ice road being built? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We continually communicate with all the residents of Northwest Territories and residents and businesses with these annual shutdowns of these ferries. We know it's interruptive, and we will continue to communicate with them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, the member in the N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, earlier I spoke about the tourist boom in Tuktoyaktuk, and my questions are for the Minister of ITI. Mr. Speaker, to make sure that the community of Tuktoyaktuk can continue to provide essential services that are required for the 2019 tourist season, my question is, will the N.W.T commit to an RV park or visitor center or other infrastructure that is crucially needed? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is an interesting situation. As we all know in this House, for many of us that follow this file very closely, with the construction of the N.W.T to Tuktoyaktuk Highway, it's brought an enormous amount of people up to the members' riding. I think the big challenge around the community has been, and I've been up there quite a bit and talked to residents in that area, the amount of influx of people was overwhelming for the community for the most part. When they had over 5,000 people, I believe, that came there this summer. We've had a number of meetings with the community leading up to this for a number of years. We've assisted them with development plans on how they want to address some of these things. We've committed to doing certain things with them. We're trying to do a wayside pull-out right now along the ITH. Is one of the funding things that we're looking at, and we're working with hunters and trappers on that to try to resolve which place they actually wanted. There was 3 places put forward, and I think we have it narrowed down to 2 of them. We committed another amount of funding, somewhere around $42,000, to complete a feasibility study to advance a culture center. But I think what we need to do with the community going forward is we need to get back in there and have a conversation of what happened this year with the amount of people that was there, what kind of needs that need to be put into place. But a lot of this stuff needs to be entrepreneur driven. The government of Northwest Territories cannot do everything for everybody. There's a lot of opportunity around tourism and things going up forward. I've had a number of discussions with people around the RV park for Tuktoyaktuk. I've had people come to me say they wanted to do it, then they come back and say they didn't want to do it, then someone else has come to me, they want to do it, and the Hamlet was into the discussions, and then they've called off those discussions. As of late, I've sat down with the mayor when I had an opportunity on a trip to Inuvik and had those discussions, and we will certainly continue to have those discussions on what we need to address this. It's a different situation because most communities are struggling. How are we going to be able to change our economy? And we're in a situation in a Tuk that there's almost an overwhelming opportunity. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, member in the N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I believe that having an RV park or some sort of infrastructure like that should fall on the Department of the N.W.T and ITI, and maybe other departments within the government. I think it's only fair, given that Tuktoyaktuk use a lot of their capacity to do what they can to ensure that they did their best, Mr. Speaker. I don't know if I got a solid answer there. But, Mr. Speaker, my second question is that will the N.W.T fund a full-time tourism coordinator so that additional capacity can be provided? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. These positions we've rolled out. We had 3 of them rolled out. We had 1 in Tuk, 1 in Haver, 1 in Delaney. I think the challenge of what the member is asking us for a full-time coordinator was these were going to be rolled around the Northwest Territories as demand increased in other communities. This is an ongoing funding, I think, for a little bit, but we're going to sit down and look at which next 3 communities wanted to apply for this. I know we're going to sit down with the community here shortly, as I've said, and all the stakeholders and see what's happened in this past year and what type of assistance is going to be needed. So I can't commit to if we're going to continue this ongoing funding, but there is ongoing funding for different communities, and maybe after the discussion we have with the community, maybe I'll have to make a decision that, if Tuk has the biggest need going across the board, that we're going to have to continue to look at their assistance. But I'll have to get more information once we have this stakeholder meeting. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Tadade Kasi, member in N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's good to see that the department's going in that direction where they're consulting with communities and the needs. Mr. Speaker, the community of Tuck is also dealing with the issue of a funded N.W.T economic development officer, the EDO. This position was set up through the Hamlet of Tuck, and there's some uncertainty as we speak. Mr. Speaker, the contract is on a year-by-year basis. Mr. Speaker, can this position, my question to the minister is, can this position come directly through the government of Northwest Territories like other surrounding communities rather than through the Hamlet of Tuck? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My understanding on some of these positions like this in some of the smaller communities is we were having a hard time to fill some of these positions. But one of the considerations we took with the Hamlet at Tuck was, and we give them a significant amount of money to do this on a year-to-year basis, which is ongoing, by the way, but they have the flexibility to hire the individual they want. We've had cases where I've had people of some communities come to me and they don't like our EDOs in another community that are assisting them. This gives the community the flexibility to hire the exact person that they want. Chances are, in this case right now, the person lives within the community and is part of the community and has done a great amount of work on this file for the residents of Tuktoyaktuk and the Northwest Territories. And we have no plans of bringing this within to the government of Northwest Territories. We want to give the community the flexibility to continue to hire the person they want to suit their needs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nundere Kasi, member in N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's good to hear that there are no plans, but as well, I think that if they do not plan on taking it on, they should fund the position appropriately, like other positions that in economic development in the government of Northwest Territories. Mr. Speaker, what will the Department of ITI do in the upcoming months to advance a tourism development plan for the community of Tuktoyaktuk with the Hamlet? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've said in the coming weeks here, we're going to sit down with all the stakeholders in the community to find out what needs to be addressed in the coming months ahead for the next tourist season. But during those discussions, the Hamlet of Tuck is going to have to come up with their own tourist development plan. They have to lead it. They're going to have to lead it. They're going to have to own it. They're going to have to need it and put it in place. But we are there to assist them to do that. But we're also currently in a conversation with Canor to help develop another tourist development workshop in the coming months. So there's a number of things going on, as I've said, and it's a good position to be in, but it's also a challenging one, I think, for some of the community members too, to take advantage of these real opportunities that lay there. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Canada, member of Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Aujourd'hui, j'ai des questions pour le premier.
For the Prime Minister.
About the recent N.W.T Economic Symposium. When the Premier answered questions in the House on March 1st, he said that, quote, purpose of the summit is to seek input into the writing of the N.W.T chapter of the Arctic Policy Framework, end of quote. Can the Premier explain how this event morphed into a discussion of non-renewable resource development projects and infrastructure corridors? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Economic Symposium, or better known as N.W.T Economic Symposium, was funded using retained resource revenues from the Intergovernmental Council, which all Intergovernmental Council members fully supported. 3 participants from each Indigenous governments were funded. Many brought additional participants who were funded directly from their intergovernmental officers' budgets. The costs are still being calculated by the symposium and will be provided once the calculations are done. The member dismisses the discussions as only being about infrastructure, but the discussions was what was important to the Aboriginal leaders of the Northwest Territories, and I wouldn't belittle those discussions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nakita Cassie, member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Of course, I'm going to take issue with what the Premier said there. I had intended no disrespect whatsoever to our Indigenous governments. I'm talking about the lack of communications about this event with this side of the House. But the Premier promised on March 1st that this meeting would be about economic diversification, the meeting would be inclusive, and that experts from various sectors would be involved. Can the Premier explain whether the symposium was inclusive with representation from various economic sectors and experts? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Generally, he who pays the bill calls the tune. So, along with Indigenous leaders and economic development representatives, there was a facilitator who is an expert in economic research and analysis in attendance. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tadada, Cassie, Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I'd like to thank the Premier for that information. Would have been helpful to have gotten it ahead of time, of course, but he said that he would be pleased to discuss the event with committees and that we should at least have a discussion of it, referring to involvement of regular MLAs in the symposium. I don't recall any such discussion, and we only got notice of it about less than a week in advance through the weekly ministerial activity media release. So can the Premier explain why regular MLAs were not involved in the symposium and why he did not fulfill the commitments he made in March in this House? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. The Honourable Premier.
As I said, the symposium is being funded by retained earnings from the Intergovernmental Council. So it was focused on the Aboriginal leaders. The focus of the symposium was seeking input and agreement from our partners, N.W.T. Indigenous governments, that the N.W.T. economy needs urgent attention. The symposium was in support of implementing the priorities of the Legislative Assembly to grow and diversify the Northwest Territories economy and work more closely with Indigenous governments. It was not about identifying new priorities. Through the discussion, we identified concrete plans and actions to stimulate the Northwest Territories economy by leveraging the individual resources and authorities of participating Indigenous governments and organizations in coordination with the government of Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nundere, Cassie, Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thanks to the Premier for that. The only public information about this symposium is a one-page communique. We have little idea of who was actually there, how much it cost, whether there will be some fuller report of this event. And of course, all of this was done with zero input from this side of the House. Can the Premier table in this House before the end of the sitting the cost of the event, a list of participants, and a full report of what transpired to help inform the debate and discussion? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A summary report of the symposium presentations, discussions, and outcomes are being prepared and will be shared with the symposium participants. This report will also be shared publicly once the participants have reviewed. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Ikeda Canyon, the Member South 2.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following up to my statement, my questions are to the Minister of Infrastructure. Last June, I was very pleased to witness the $140 million in funding that is dedicated to the development of an all-weather highway in the Mackenzie Valley. Can the Minister of Infrastructure provide us with an update as to what work is currently being done? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to remind the House this was a key milestone in the mandate that we secured, so it was nice to see this funding for this project. The funding has been secured to date will help with the construction of the Bear River Bridge, the planning and environmental studies that led to the obtaining permits for road construction between Wrigley and the new completed Canyon Creek All-Access Road, as well as construction to an access road from Wrigley to Mount Cadet. Canyon Creek All-Season Access Road represents a first step in converting the existing Mackenzie Valley Highway Winter Road into an all-weather highway. I'm pleased to advise members that the official opening of this road will take place in November in Norman Wells, when more information will be coming shortly on that. The work in the new The work is now in progress on acquiring permits for the Great Bear River Bridge. The Department of Infrastructure has been undertaking engagement with communities and residents in the Satu region to gain input to finalize aspects of the project and working to complete applications for permitting. The department also so far has held meetings in Delaney, Covell Lake, and Toledo, including a public meeting and separate meetings with the hamlet. And meetings are scheduled later this month with Norman Wells Land Corporation membership and the public, as well as a public meeting in Fort Good Hope. In terms of next steps for the environmental assessment development and access road to Wrigley to Mount Cadet, we are examining options and that are available to make the determination of the best approach to proceed. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Nakirade, Council Member Satu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the Minister for that reply. My next question, Mr. Speaker, then, the N.W.T already has environmental assessment underway with this project through the Mackenzie Valley Impact Review Board. What is the plan for the continuing with that? What are the next steps, and when can we expect to see the environmental assessment move ahead? Condense that into one reply, please. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi, there were several questions there. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, there was, but I think it's important that we get this information out there. The environmental assessment process was initiated by the government in 2013 for the full proposed Mackenzie Valley Highway. The proposed project was rescoped in 2015 to focus on the section of highway from Wrigley to Norman Wells. In February 2015, the Mackenzie Valley Environmental Impact Review Board released its terms of reference, requiring further studies be undertaken by the department in order to complete the developer assessment report for the environmental assessment. The Department of Infrastructure is in discussions with staff from the board to confirm options available and next steps in terms of proceeding with the ongoing environmental assessment. Before any final decisions are made, the Department of Infrastructure will also be discussing next steps with the Satu Secretariat Incorporated and the Penzi Kay First Nation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Tarade, Council Member Satu.
Thanks to the Minister for the continuation of where was our government leaving off in the past. My next question, I'm glad to hear that the things are moving ahead. Who has the department met with to date and to discuss the environmental assessment for the Mackenzie Valley Highway? Masi, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The department staff, as I said, with the Mackenzie Valley Environmental Impact Review Board to discuss the environmental assessment options. Staff will be meeting with the board of the Satu Secretariat Incorporated and Chief and Council of the Penzi Kay First Nation next week, as well as officials from the Canadian Northern Economic Development Agency Northern Project Management Office. These discussions will influence how the department will approach the environmental assessment and the timing of any associated activities consistent with an overarching objective of proceeding through environmental review and permitting process as effectively as possible while ensuring all related concerns are mitigated and all required approvals are obtained. A final decision on the best approach will be made in the coming weeks once the discussions have concluded, and that decision will inform the path forward, including next steps and timelines. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nundere, Council Member Satu.
Speaker, my last question, Mr. Speaker, is will the Minister offer my office a schedule of upcoming events, say, for example, if there is to be a community consultation in Toledo or Norman Wells, the nearest impacted communities, will that schedule be provided to me so I can accompany the project team? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, we will closely work with the member on his particular region around these projects. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Cannon, the member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the Department of Health staff for taking steps to address an issue that I brought up in the last sitting. Even though dialysis treatment is offered in Hay River, it's always fully subscribed, and as a result, there were a number of residents who were living at Vital Able House in Yellowknife so that they could access dialysis treatment. What the department did was give these residents an option to fly to and from Yellowknife from Hay River 3 times a week so they could receive treatment. And by all accounts, this has worked out very well. My constituents are very happy with this option. There's been no hiccups with transportation. So my first question is, when I see my constituents on the flight home later today, can I assure them that this pilot project will continue and that they can go home to their bed every night? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The short answer is yes, but there's always conditions. We want to keep working with our residents to make sure that they're getting the support they need, but we also acknowledge that it has been good so far, but we've also had pretty decent weather and the flights have all been on time. If it looks like we might be having some complications, we need to be flexible, and we may have to bring them in for a week or two from time to time, depending on those things. But our intention now is to continue to work with our residents across the Northwest Territories, not just those in Hay River, while we do our review of dialysis services in the Northwest Territories and come forward with larger solutions and larger options. But in the interim, we're going to work with our residents one-on-one. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, the Kitadea Cassie member, Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I understand that everywhere else has it worse really than Yellowknife and Hay River when it comes to dialysis, because those are the only 2 places to receive treatment. And so I appreciate that. I believe there's someone from Fort Smith and Fort Resolution, or rather Fort Providence and Fort Resolution, who drive in 3 times a week to Hay River for treatment. Last time I spoke about this, the minister stated that he heard loud and clear that we need to do more to provide dialysis services closer to home, and he would prefer not to have people going from Hay River to Yellowknife to receive that service. He stated there's a lot of work to be done and that we, quote, we are prepared to start that work. Can the minister please detail the work done to date? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is a territorial problem. We have residents across the Northwest Territories that dialysis. So we're looking at it from a territorial lens, recognizing, of course, that both Hay River and Yellowknife are the only places that dialysis is currently located. The authority and the department have already begun their analysis. They're looking at other options like home-based dialysis. I think one member did mention a traveling dialysis. There's some concerns about that, especially the models that exist in the south. But we started to explore those options. Also recognizing that we need a big solution, a big, comprehensive solution for the whole territories. We're also trying to find some short-term wins, and that we've been exploring the opportunity of sharing some resources between Stanton and Hay River to balance out where the resources need to be, where the existing machinery exists today. So we're working on some details. We're open to have some short-term solutions as we continue to move on finding some larger, more appropriate territorial solutions.
Kitadea Cassie member, Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I appreciate that it sounds like a lot of work has been done so far. The minister mentioned sharing resources between Stanton and Hay River. Could the minister please elaborate on that? And would that entail perhaps bringing resources to Hay River physically so that these residents wouldn't have to fly back and forth? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Social Service.
Mr. Speaker, we're not intending to move equipment back and forth, obviously, but we have trained professionals here in Fort Smith and in Yellowknife, and some really great trained professionals in Hay River. The question is whether or not we can actually have some of our staff go back and forth rather than some of the patients. There are some complications there. We're trying to figure out whether that's even a possibility. But right now we're exploring all options. Like I said, we're trying to find some short-term solutions, some short-term wins to support our residents, but also this has to be done in view of territorial solutions as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nundidea Cassie member, Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And could the minister please provide us with some timelines on these possible short-term solutions and on the longer-term territory-wide solution to this issue? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have certain processes within the Government of the Northwest Territories, business planning, budget planning, and whatnot. I imagine larger-term solutions will have to follow that cycle, but we're trying to find some short-term, interim solutions with existing resources that we can actually implement during the 18-19 fiscal year, and we're hoping that we will be able to finish that work, recognizing that that's part of the solution, and it will not be the comprehensive solution. That will follow our normal processes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Cannon, the member Trinity Willady.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I talked about the capital in the riding of N.W.T. I'd like to ask the Minister of Finance questions on the capital planning process. I'd like to ask the Minister in this House who is responsible for the capital plan, who has final responsibility. Thank you.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there's an interdepartmental working group. They analyze the capital asset come forward from each department and make recommendations to the Deputy Minister Capital Planning Committee, who then, and that's shared by the Deputy Minister of Finance, and includes all deputies. They review the recommendations made by the working group and either accept or vary the recommendations. Then they provide recommendations to the Financial Management Board, and the Financial Management Board will review the recommendations of the Planning Committee and either accept or vary the recommendations. The next part of the capital plan is provided to committee for review, and in-camera reviews are scheduled. Feedback from committee can result in capital plans being varied, and then the final review of the capital plan takes place on the floor of the House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Cassie member Trinity Willady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I was going to ask the Minister to lay out the process, which he's already done. But I guess what appears to be missing from the process is the weight. I'm not talking about W-A-I-T, but the weight of each of the projects as they come forward are brought forward by the various deputy ministers to the capital planning through the capital planning process. I don't know which process determines which has priority, and I guess coming down to the question would be how does the N.W.T prioritize the actual projects once they've gone through each project that it comes up for a capital planning process? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there's a 20-year capital plan that most departments have, and there's an overall 20-year capital plan. And then there's a 5-year capital plan. There's a number of projects that could get on these plans, but sometimes the plans change. If they find that there's another facility or a building that's unsafe for the occupants, then that might take priority over one that's on the 5-year capital plan. That may get pushed back a bit. I think we've all that have been around in the building for a while have seen that, where plans get pushed back a bit because of other circumstances. So that would be the process that would be used. If it is on the 5-year capital plan, then normally the planning would start for that. But if for some unforeseen reason something else happens to any of the other government assets, then that may have to take priority because of the safety issues that come along with it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Cassie member Trinity Willady.
Mr. Speaker, assuming that everything remains and there's no emergencies, I'd like to ask the Minister if factors such as employment play into the capital planning process. I know it's an important aspect of this Assembly to ensure that we have employment. As many of us said, including the Minister of Finance, employment is the best social program that we can have. I'd like to know if that specific item where what I'm trying to say is, like, if there's a community that has an employment rate of 40% versus a community that has an employment rate of 70%, is that a factor when we're allocating capital projects? Because right now what's happening in my riding is the projects are getting completed. The young people that are being trained and are ready to take the next project on will have to work in other communities to fill in the gap. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, first of all, that's a good thing. If these young people are getting the skills that they needed and the contractor wants to move them to other communities. I think that's a good thing. And when we debate the capital budget, as we're going to be doing, you'll find that there's a number of other projects for other communities. So if contractors are able to secure that work, then they may move these folks there. And then there'll be an opportunity, if there's other projects in their hometown, to come back home. So I always believe that's a good thing, and it expands their skills, their knowledge. And but as far as the employment goes, I don't believe that plays a part in the prioritizing of projects. Again, it goes back to safety and whether that this building needs to be replaced for safety reasons and how long it's been on the capital plan. So, but the member makes a good point, and I agree with them that if they have to move around with the work, then that's a good thing. They're being recognized for the skills that they gained when the project was in their home community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question. No dere Council Member Trinidad Wolode.
Mr. Speaker, I agree with somewhat with some parts of what the minister is saying. Some of the students like to, the employees like to go to other projects in other communities, but many of them cannot. So I'd like to ask the minister, I know that they use several factors to determine, I think, 5 or 6 different factors to weighed up against other factors to determine which capital planning, which capital item or infrastructure item will be placed first on the infrastructure list for each year that we review in the House. I'd like to ask the minister if there is a possibility that it's sort of like a social factor, I guess, of getting away from the technical factors, so they could add employment as part of a key factor to when determining which communities will get infrastructure projects. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as much as I agree with the member on the importance of employment in the small communities, and I think through a number of the different programs that the government of the Northwest Territories offers as far as infrastructure goes, I think we've seen an example through the Small Community Employment Fund, through the Rural and Remote Community Committee. There was some money that was allocated for some employment opportunities in small communities, but I don't believe that particular one is factored in with the prioritizing of projects. I don't even know if it should be, to be quite honest with you. Maybe it's a discussion we need to have. Again, I'll go back to the fact that we do have infrastructure deficit that's quite large, and all communities in Northwest Territories need projects. We hear that here in the House, and we go back to our capital budget that we're going to be debating in the next couple of weeks in this House, and I think we're going to see that there's a huge infrastructure budget, and there should be benefits for all those across the territory. I think I took the long way to answer the member's question. Is no, I don't believe that employment factor would be prioritized as part of allocating projects in the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, County, the member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday I talked about the effects of climate change and the importance of taking action now. The federal government has indicated that the way in which we're going to do that is by changing folks' behavior, and that was going to be through an applied carbon tax. The N.W.T signed on to the federal plan for a carbon tax, and even though we had previously argued against it, saying such a tax wouldn't or wasn't appropriate for the North. And so, can the minister describe what the tax was, in fact, intended to accomplish? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sorry, my questions are for the Minister of Finance. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, the N.W.T signed on to the Clean Growth and Climate Change framework, and carbon pricing is actually an element of that. We didn't sign onto carbon pricing just yet. We have a MOU that we're in the final stages of drafting, or it's in its final stages right now. We have not signed that yet. Member is correct. We were against carbon pricing when it first came out because we knew that it was going to have a detrimental effect on people in the Northwest Territory. Once we realized that the federal government was going to implement this regardless of whether we were in or not, then we took steps and showed some leadership in coming up with a made in N.W.T. approach that we thought would benefit or minimize the impact that the federal backstop. Had we gone with the federal backstop, it would have been quite costly to people in Northwest Territories, and I would have encouraged people not to stand by the border because people would have been leaving so fast you'd have got run over. So we've come up with a plan that, although not perfect, addresses a lot of the concerns that we heard from the public across the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nakira Cassie, member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the minister's reply, and I certainly do appreciate the effort that they've put in with regarding to protecting Northerners' interests, especially around the cost of living. But as maybe a supplement to that question, then I just want to ask the minister, then, is there or has there ever been discussions to use carbon tax to mitigate the climate change impacts by changing people's behavior? I mean, if that's what the federal government said it was intended to do, was there ever discussions between ourselves and the federal governments to apply it in that manner, that it would be used to change people's behavior so that we could protect the impacts of climate change? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Finance.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the federal government, that was their original intent, was try to curb people's behaviors so not to contribute to climate change. So they came up with the carbon pricing carbon price tax. And so we in turn had to make some adjustments to try and minimize the impact that it was going to have on the people in Northwest Territory. But the intent was to curb people's behavior so that there's less greenhouse gas emission. But I think even the federal government realizes that in the Northwest Territories, and we use the word uniqueness a number of times, our situation is a little different, and we've had an opportunity to use their idea to leverage some funding to try and help with some transitional projects in the Northwest Territories to actually contribute to our reduction in greenhouse gas emission. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Tadadea Cassie, member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for the reply. You know, northern communities, industry and residents are already taking significant steps on their own initiative to invest in renewable energy. We've seen numerous examples of that throughout the territory, whether it's the windmills at Diavik, the solar panels in Colville Lake, or just folks doing improvements on their homes. Because we're doing it on our own, doesn't it make sense to not even burden residents with the new tax, especially if it's not going to do what the federal government intended it to do, and that was to change people's behavior? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Of Finance.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I mean, first of all, this government does not want to burden people with a new tax. Had we used the federal backstop, which they were going to use regardless, it would have cost people in Northwest Territories a lot more. I want to make that quite clear. And through a number of our approach to carbon pricing, and I do believe that our document is public. I know I've briefed committee on it. I've got some feedback from committee on it, so I do know that we have a backstop that we're using. One of the things is the cost of living offset that we propose to help offset some of the high cost of implementing this. And the N.W.T. child benefit is another one that we're using. So we've taken some steps to try and mitigate the impact on people in Northwest Territory. Again, I have to reiterate that the federal government was going to impose this no matter what, and I think we've met the challenge of trying to minimize the impact on people in the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nudere Cassie, member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for the reply. Yes, the federal government was going to impose it on us no matter what, but as we've seen around the country, there are a number of different jurisdictions that are mounting arguments against Ottawa's carbon plan. And, you know, if we were joining the new carbon regime, that very future seems to be in doubt. So does the minister still think that this is the way to go, or are we still going to go through this carbon tax, Made in the North carbon tax, come January? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we're monitoring what the other jurisdictions across the country are doing, and we will continue to do that. As I said before, we haven't signed the MOU yet. We're still working with Ottawa, but again, I go back to the point that Ottawa is going to implement this regardless what the other jurisdictions are doing. They'll implement. They'll have their fight with the other jurisdictions. I just want to be sure that our territory is ready, that when the date comes to implement carbon pricing, then we are ready for it, and if there's any benefits to be gained from it while mitigating the impact on people in Northwest Territories, we'll take full advantage of that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question. Cannon, the member Decho.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday I was in Fort Providence, the home community of Premier McLeod. So my question is to Premier McLeod. It was a proud day in Fort Providence. Everyone was there, but sadly there was no N.W.T senior officials. Can the Premier explain what was the N.W.T's role in establishing a DG as a protected area? Merci.
Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The reason we weren't there is we received an invitation 2 days before the event, and we were already scheduled to be in session. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question. Cassie, member Decho.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there was an initial scheduled signing back in September, and parties, of course, that were involved sought clarity, and one of them was the N.W.T. Can the Premier explain or update the territorial position on the subsurface withdrawal for DG? Merci.
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We had been in discussions with the Decho First Nations with regards to the subsurface of ADG. We see it as a package arrangement. We are not prepared to one-off individual sectors of the Decho process, and we had put forward a significant offer where ADG was part of it, and we have yet to receive a response to that offer. I understand that the Decho leadership will be holding leadership meetings at some point in October to determine where they want to go with regards to the Decho process. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Cassie, member Decho.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday it meant lots for the federal government of Canada to be there, Decho First Nations officials as well, and it was a big signing event. And one of the steps that needs to happen to fulfill the features of a protected area and advance it through the federal process is transferring a DG to the federal government. Could the minister or the Premier explain in terms of how that process might work out? Merci.
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There was never an intention to transfer the subsurface of the ADG back to the federal government. The discussions that we've been having is that it would be controlled in the Northwest Territories by the Aboriginal government and the government of Northwest Territories through an agreement that would be established through the Decho process. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Cassie, member Decho.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My last question is, going forward, what actions will the N.W.T take in the remainder of this assembly, the 18th assembly. Some might say that actually the 18th assembly is already over, but take to advance conservation and land protection initiatives like EDG. Merci.
Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've been in discussions with the Decho Grand Chief on several occasions. She's indicating to us that they are still doing work in this area, and we're very optimistic that they'll come back with an optimistic, positive response so that we can move forward and hopefully bring these negotiations to a conclusion before the end of this legislative assembly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question. Yellowknife Canyon, the member Yellowknife Center.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of Health and Social Services in his role as the lead on the Rock Hill fire. The Rock Hill apartments belong to the N.W.T, and they were leased to the YWCA over the long term. Rent collected from the tenants paid for the housing staff to provide wraparound services for the families. So now, not only is the building gone, but the revenue from the building is gone as well. So my first question is whether the minister is committed to this housing program continuation. Thank you.
Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, before I go into the answer, I just want to take an opportunity to thank the member for her statement and once again applaud the YWCA, the Executive Director, Lida Fuller, and the amazing staff for the incredible work they did in responding to this fire. In addition to the residents of Yellowknife, the City of Yellowknife, and the team of N.W.T staff that actually stepped up and provided some response as well. I think it was a great response. I think this community should be proud of everything they did. Mr. Speaker, the Y has been a valuable partner with the N.W.T and on behalf of residents of the Northwest Territories providing valuable programming. The lead team that we've established to work with the Y has met with the Y on one occasion. We're looking to find ways to support them moving forward. We're waiting for an ask from the Y to figure out exactly what they're looking to us for in the interim as they rebuild and figure out what our next steps are. But we are working closely with the Y. We believe they're an incredibly valuable resource to the community, not just Yellowknife, but the entire Northwest Territories, and we're looking forward to continuing our working relationship with them. Thank you.
Oral question, Nakita Cassie, member Yellowknife Center.
Mr. Speaker, could the minister give us a sense of the options that are on the table? For example, does the GNWT have access to a building that could be leased to the Y, or is there access to bridge funding to help with the continuation of the housing staff services? What's the range of options the government's willing to consider? Thank you.
Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's still early days, but it's my understanding that we don't have a building that we can make available. We are certainly reaching out to other potential partners to see what might be available, and we're working with the Y as they are doing some of their outreach as well. As far as the existing building, we do have to do some remediation on that site. We haven't figured out what our rebuild plans, if any, there are for that particular site. We haven't, like I said, received an ask from the Y on some of their bridging plans or some of their other plans, but we're prepared to continue to work with them closely. As I've already indicated, our group of deputies who took the lead on our response have reached out and have had some meetings with the Y, and we're looking forward to continuing that relationship as we work with them to find solutions that work for them, for their programming, for the residents of the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Tada Cassie, member Yellowknife Center.
I appreciate the minister's willingness to work with the Y. At the end of the day, the Y is going to have revenue to keep this housing program going. And if that revenue can't be generated from a building, then it's going to need to come from a contribution agreement. So I'm asking the minister what resources he can bring to the table for the continuation of this program. Merci.
Of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we understand the challenges that the Y is facing. We understand that they have really put themselves out there to backstop the placement of the individuals throughout the Northwest Territories that used to be in their building. and we do understand the financial risk that puts the Y in and the challenges it puts on them. I don't know what financial contribution we'll be able to make at this point. We haven't received an ask. We don't know the magnitude. We are hoping and we expect that we will see something so that we can begin to have those very discussions. But at this point, it would be premature to speculate or assume what those asks might be. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate that the Y needs to make a specific ask, and my understanding is that the leadership group there is considering that and will be making that known to the minister. My final question is about the takeaway, the minister's takeaway from the government response. I realize that only just happened, but are they going to do a debrief? Are they going to look at how the response went from their position to strengthen service delivery in the future? Not that there were any problems with the response last week. Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as the lead on our response at Health and Social Services, I've asked the deputy to actually do a debrief with the other departments to make sure that we learn from this experience. I think it went quite well, but there's always opportunity to learn from experiences. Also, how we might be able to utilize this experience for other similar incidents that may occur in different communities throughout the Northwest Territories. And it's not just Health and Social Services. MACA has a responsibility to work with communities on emergency responses to different crises that may befall a community. You know, we don't want to see these things. We would hope never to see these things, but it's important for us to be ready, and we will certainly learn from this experience. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, the member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, follow up to my member's statement, I have a few questions for the Minister of Infrastructure. We know that Fort McPherson ran out of gas and Sigachik ran short of groceries during the last winter season. How is the department prepared to prevent these kinds of crises in our small communities this winter? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I answered in my previous question, it's based around communication. We have to communicate with the people and the residents of Fort McPherson and Sigachik in particularly, but it's not up to us to tell the gas station how much gas they have in stock or the grocery store how much food they have in stock. Our job as a government is to indicate that there could be an incoming situation in which there is a significant probability that that may happen in the members' region this year because of the coldness of the water. The department has informed me it's well below the normal temperature of the water, and we suspect if conditions continue this way that the ferry is going to close prematurely, maybe up to 2 weeks earlier than normal. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's funny the minister is saying we need to communicate. Last year in this very house, I mentioned to the department that we'll have extended hours because it was so warm, yet the department pulled out the ferry prematurely while the river was open another almost 2 weeks. So it's funny the department has that response. Mr. Speaker, the Department of Infrastructure is responsible for the laws and policies that govern road, air and marine transportation, not to mention the infrastructure itself. What actions is the department taking this winter to keep the cost of living down, especially when it comes to the transportation of goods to our small communities? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to answer this question because this government has done a lot of stuff to help address the cost of living in Northwest Territories, particularly infrastructure. We have our public highway system. We subsidize ferry operations. We have community airports. All these things help support the delivery of goods to the communities. Our road system in particular is we have to keep our assets in check, so we have efficiency of resupply. Roads are particularly probably the cheapest way to get stuff to communities depending on where you are. But this government has as committed as the finance minister said today, we're going to come up with the largest capital budget probably in the history of this government, and a lot of it is around the road system and energy system, but it's going to help address the cost of living in many communities. We have a lot of communities that don't have access 24/7 or 365 a year. We secured funding for the Mackenzie Valley Highway. We've secured funding for the Toledo All-Weather Road. These things are proceeding. We've got a number of energy projects that we've clearly laid out in our 2030 energy strategy. The finance minister clearly indicated the investment that we're making in these things. And these things all go towards help to make the cost of living and our quality of life in the Northwest Territories better. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tada Cassie member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, how is the department preparing for the end of the ferry season and the beginning of the ice road season to ensure as smooth a transition as possible? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to remind the House of last year, this exact situation. We committed to having a newer, lighter of equipment to facilitate the winter road system. We have that machine up and ready. We're training our staff again in the region. Last year, if I remember the dates between and the members riding, I think the river closed on the 4th and the 8th, and both rivers were open by the 18th. So that's only 10 to 12 days of shutdown for access to light vehicles. So I think the department did a great job, and I commend them on their efforts, and we will continue to do that and make sure that the impacts are negligible on the communities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Cassie member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, now the million-dollar question, if you will. When can we expect the ferry services to be extended through the winter extension like it has in the past? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This ain't the million-dollar answer because I've answered this question a number of times in the House. The winter operations were due to around the kill well in that situation. I've said in this House many a times that the winter operation wasn't effective. The Dempster was closed 40% of the time during that operation, and the people that are the reason we did that was to secure energy for the community of Inuvik, and that has been addressed through the contractors. And we are not committed to putting any more money into winter operations of that ferry. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. I'd like to remind members that we haven't gone through all members asking questions due to the fact that some of the questions and answers were a bit long. So just a reminder as we move forward to be cautious around answering and the questioning. So I'll allow a member for Can Lake to ask the oral questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, colleagues. Mr. Speaker, the Snare Forks Hydro Facility has been reported as having a bearing failure, and now the public reports on this say the unit will be offline for several months, which represents a loss of 4.3 megawatts of power, approximately 15% of the hydro system's total generating capacity. So my question to the minister responsible for the Power Corporation is what will be the impact of this technical failure on the cost of living of Northerners and the power rates that ratepayers are paying? Thank you.
Minister responsible for N.W.T. Power Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, looking after the best interests of people in the Northwest Territories is what this government is all about. The impact on electricity costs is not known at this time, and any impact on NTPC costs is expected to be mitigated by the insurance claim. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nakita Cassie, member Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the minister for that reassurance. So the estimated cost of these repairs, regardless of what that's going to be, or the final cost of these repairs, the insurance claim is going to cover that? Is that the department's best estimation at this point? Thank you.
Minister responsible for N.W.T. Power Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my understanding that there is a team that's flying to do an inspection and determine the next steps, and I would assume that cost would be the next step, and then once the costs are determined, then I would assume they would have a discussion with the insurance company as to see what would be covered. So once we have that more detailed information, I'll share it with committee if it's their wish. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Council Member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So that covers the mechanical aspects of repairing this issue, but there will be more costs required for the backup diesel system. Can the minister speak to what the equivalent cost to generate the loss of 15% of power through diesel is? Is he aware of those numbers now? Can you share them with the House? Thank you.
Responsible for N.W.T. Power Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the insurance is expected to cover some of the costs associated with the equipment failure, including the need to increase diesel consumption. We do have sufficient backup there, diesel hydro backup, to keep the unit operating. Again, this just happened, I believe, Monday, or it was just recently, and Tuesday, October 9th. So it just happened. So we're just in the process of determining, doing an inspection, determining what associated costs might be tied to the failure. And again, as soon as we have those numbers or estimates of numbers and what it may cost, we'll share that with committee. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Council Member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the Minister for providing this information. I know it's a live event, and I see there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, but if he could just reassure taxpayers that if there are costs not covered by the insurance, that the government will carry the burden of that, so we're not putting the cost back onto our citizens. Thank you.
Minister responsible for N.W.T. Power Corporation.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Although that's good brochure material, I can't make that commitment right now to have the government cover the cost of we will have to determine what, and then we'll make a determination then what it may cost the ratepayers, if any. But I can't make that commitment right now. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Written questions. Written questions. Returns to written questions. Returns to written questions. Replies to Commissioner's opening address. Replies to Commissioner's opening address. Petitions. Petitions. Reports of Standing Special Committee. Reports of Standing Special Committee. Reports on the Committee on Review of Bills. Reports of Committee on the Review of Bills. Tabling of documents. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following three documents entitled Report on the Staff Retention Policy for 2015-16, 2016-17, 2017-18, pursuant to Section 64, Bracket 2 of the Liquor Act. I wish to table Northwest Territorial Liquor Licensing Board 64th Annual Report 2017-18, and pursuant to Section 27, Bracket 4 of the Northern Employee Benefits Service Pension Plan, I wish to table Northern Employee Benefits Service Pension Plan Annual Report for the year ending December 31st, 2017. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Tabling of documents. Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following four documents. Pursuant to Section 32 in brackets 2 of the Financial Administration Act, I wish to table Northwest Territories Surface Rights Board 2017-2018 Annual Report and Legal Aid Commission of the Northwest Territories Annual Report 2017-2018. Pursuant to Section 10, brackets 2 of the Victims of Crime Act, I wish to table 29th Annual Report 2017-2018 Victims Assistance Committee of the Northwest Territories, and pursuant to Section 74.2, brackets 2 of the Residential Tenancies Act, I wish to table Annual Report on the activities of the rental officer April 1st, 2017 to March 31st, 2018. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Notices of motion. Notices of motion. Notices of motion for first reading bills. Notices of motion for first reading bills. Motions. Motions. First reading of bills. First reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Consideration Committee of the Whole Bills and Other Matters. Minister Statement 19-18.3. Table document 215-18.3 with member Hay River North in the chair.
I call Committee of the Whole to order. What is the wish of committee? Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that the chair rise and report progress.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. There's a motion on the floor to report progress. The motion is in order and non-debatable. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. I will rise and report progress. Thank you, committee.
May I have the report, member Hay River North?
Mr. Speaker, your committee has been considering Minister Statement 19-18(3) Aurora College Foundational Review and Table Document 215-18(3) Capital Estimates 2019-2020 and would like to report progress. And Mr. Speaker, I move that the report of the Committee of the Whole be concurred with.
Do I have a seconder? Member for Cam Lake. Motion's in order. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Massey. Third reading of bills. Third reading of bills. Mr. Clerk, orders of the day.
Mr. Speaker, there will be a meeting of the Board of Management at the Rise of the House today, as well as a meeting of the Standing Committee on Government Operations at 2:30 p.m. today. Orders of the day for Friday, October 12th, 2018. My apologies. Orders of the day for Monday, October 15th, 2018, 1:30 p.m. Prayer, minister statements, member statements, returns to oral questions, recognition of visitors in the gallery, acknowledgements, oral questions, returns to written questions, replies to Commissioner's opening address, petitions, reports of standing and special committees, reports of committees on the review of bills, tabling of documents, notices of motion for first reading of bills, motions, first reading of bills, second reading of bills, consideration in committee of the whole of bills and other matters, Minister Statement 9-18.3, table document 215-18.3, Bill 7, Bill 13, Bill 14, Bill 15, Bill 16, and Bill 17. Report of Committee of the Whole, third reading of bills, orders of the day.
This House stands adjourned till Monday, October 15, 1:30 p.m.